After these remarks, I will introduce our first presenter. He is Mark Priestley from UK. I will read his curriculum from the web because I think that it's very interesting, and it is interesting to know all the background. Mark Priestley is currently Professor of Education and Director of the Curriculum and Pedagogy Research Cluster in the School of Education at the University of Stirling. His research interests relate to the school curriculum, especially curriculum change, and the professional work of teachers. He started his career in education as a teacher of history, working in a number of secondary schools in England and New Zealand. Since arriving at the School of Education at Stirling in 2001, he has taken on a number of roles: Director of Initial Teacher Education between 2024 and 27. He was director of the first year undergraduate program between 2009 and 2011, and director of postgraduate research between 2013 and 2014. External roles include editor of the Scottish Educational Review between 2007 and 2010, council member for the British Educational Research Association, and chair of this association in the Academic Publications Committee. He is also co-convener of the European Educational Research Association Network 3, Curriculum Innovation. So Mark will talk us about the new curriculum in Scotland, policy and the practice in Scotland. So Mark, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I shall stand up. Can people hear me at the back? Yes, if you indicate. Okay, I feel a bit of a fraud actually, because all these grand titles, but actually what they mean more than anything else is I have the word mug written on my forehead, that people can see me coming and I get my arm twisted to do these jobs. I have done quite a bit since I've been at Stirling, and I'm still doing quite a bit, but what really drives me is theorising and thinking about the curriculum. I've had a long-term interest in this. As a history teacher in Yorkshire, in England, I got interested in the curriculum, did a master's in the early 90s. I then found out that, in fact, that when I went out to New Zealand and was faced with a completely different context, I found out that, in fact, that I was the teacher that I hated when I was at school. Right? So I'd spent a lot of time developing these wonderful approaches to teaching, and then realised, in fact, that this was just the sort of schooling I absolutely hated. So I spent a lot of time since thinking about that. And when I came into Scotland in 2001, this thing arrived shortly afterwards. It's called Curriculum for Excellence. I don't like the term excellence. I don't like the term curriculum for excellence at all. But, and there is some moves afoot at the moment to rename it the curriculum, which I think would be entirely helpful. Right? But this arrived in 2004, and I found myself actually really probably quite uniquely placed to comment on it. The work I was doing initially wasn't very much welcomed by the Scottish Government. We put some research out in 2012, and the first thing they did was reach for the garlic and the crucifix. They really weren't interested in the research that we were doing. However, the relations I have are a lot more positive now, and this is a curriculum which to outsiders looks really progressive. We've got had a number of colleagues come to Stirling, Gert Beester, for example, who worked at Stirling for a number of years, who couldn't believe just what a progressive curriculum this was from the outside until you start to see it in operation. And we have a head teacher from Scotland here who's seen this in operation. What's wrong with it? Well, the big ideas at the front end, which I'll talk about shortly, are actually really good. But we have a problem with several things. One is that the policy that surrounds those big ideas lacks a certain coherence, and I'll say a little bit more about that. The second is that it's been transplanted into a system which is inherently traditional. So teachers in Scotland are, on the whole, following a traditionalist, transmissionist sort of approach to education, particularly in secondary schools, but often in primary schools as well. I was talking to a colleague from New Zealand who's been commenting on the introduction of a very similar curriculum, who says that the main difference between Scotland and New Zealand is that the teachers in New Zealand already buy into a constructivist view of curriculum and teaching and learning. And therefore, what the curriculum has done, the new curriculum policy, has bring the government into line with their thinking. In Scotland, it's been seen as something quite challenging. The third issue is that Scotland practices a sort of softer version of what has been described in the English context as a sort of culture of performativity. high levels of accountability through inspections, attainment data, use of big data, and so on, but without the marketized element that England has. So teachers who are seeking to innovate in Scotland using this curriculum framework are often finding that they are coming up against all sorts of really quite serious risks. That innovating is tricky when you are being judged on the performance of your school. Okay, so that's the sort of little bit of background here. Okay, so what is the new curriculum? I would like to start off here with a plug for our book, which has been out for about a year. It's out in paperback on the 18th of December. It's called Reinventing the Curriculum. In that book, we outlined through a number of contributions from some key authors what we've described as a curricular turn in Anglophone countries. And it's been well documented elsewhere. So, for example, Michael Young has talked about how we see a shift from very prescriptive specification of knowledge, for example, in England's national curriculum of the late 80s and early 90s, through to what is described as genericism, a move away from knowledge towards skills. There is a new focus here on the centrality of the learner. Curriculum for Excellence talks a lot about active learning, active forms of pedagogy, and this notion that teachers are no longer teachers, but the guide on the side, the facilitator of learning, which I think is quite problematic. I'd like to see a sort of more nuanced combination look, I suppose. This type of curriculum has been articulated both as key competencies, and I'll show you what Scotland's look like in a minute. They're called the 4 capacities, and also as accessible outcomes. And there was a move in the early days of Curriculum for Excellence to move away from the outcomes model and make them a lot softer, but that's changed. I'll come back to that as well. We see modular courses and ladders of qualifications. So in Scotland, from the age of 15 onwards, pupils can do a succession of one-year courses which take them up a level on the ladder at a time until they leave school, often with a lot of repeats. So my daughter, who's been through the system, did Stalin's Russia in history 3 years on the trot. The same topic, but just assessed at a slightly higher level each time. And then this is, I think, the key constraining factor when we're talking about implementing this sort of curriculum here, what Kuiper and colleagues have called output regulation, the way in which we steer education through outputs, and those outputs may be the use of accessible targets and judging schools through league tables, etc. Or they may be through the use of external inspections, which have got a long pedigree in Scotland. And there is some recognition in Scotland that this is damaging, but not enough, because what's happened is that the basic methodology has stayed the same. It's just been softened in terms of its language. But schools still get inspected. Schools are still judged on their attainment data. Okay, so in 2004 then, Scotland introduced its own version of this hybrid new curriculum. And there's some extracts from it here, which really give a flavour of it. Making learning active, challenging and enjoyable. Reducing fragmentation and overcrowding, connecting stages. This is sort of fine, lofty aspirations here. It's about experiential learning. It's about placing the student at the centre of the curriculum. And down at the bottom, something that actually would seem a bit of a joke to people who have been through the last couple of years in Scotland, ensuring that assessment supports learning rather than driving learning. Now, in Scotland, in the last 2 years, schools have been implementing new national qualifications, and typically young people have been sitting 4 or 5 tests a week as part of those, because it's a competency-based model. I won't say much more about that today. These are the 4 capacities. Now, Walter Humes and I, the colleague who wrote a paper on this with me, had a bit of fun swapping the adjectives around, so we wondered if it would make any difference if we had confident learners and successful individuals, etc. As far as we could see, it doesn't make any difference, but actually those aren't the important things. What's important are these attributes and capabilities. And yes, they're open to critique. So for example, if we take the responsible citizen one here, it has been critiqued for its lack of focus on active political engagement, for example. It tends to focus citizenship in Scotland around personal responsibility and participation. But taken aside, I think that these actually represent a fairly coherent and certainly well-articulated set of purposes of education. And I'm going to present for you today 3 alternative trajectories which schools can take when developing this curriculum. And we've got some empirical evidence from a couple of research projects, plus we've also worked actively with schools on trajectory number 3, which I'll explain later. But this is what teachers were faced with. If you go into any classroom in Scotland, particularly primary schools, I was in one on Friday, you'll see these slogans on posters around the walls. But actually, there's limited evidence that people have gone very far in making sense of those core ideas underneath there. Okay, now this is the fine detail. One of the things that was set in stone right from early on was this notion that Curriculum for Excellence would continue to be an outcomes-based curriculum, and this is really at the heart of my critique of it. I'll come back to that in a second. The government minister who was in charge at the time said quite clearly when the first document was put out in a ministerial response that Scotland would continue to base its education around frameworks of outcomes. So these are an example from biology. They're quite interesting and quite distinctive because they combine both experiences and outcomes. So you can know the symptoms of a common disease is caused by germs, which is an outcome, but you can articulate it through explanation or through a presentation or by writing a report, etc. And these are quite typical of the form that these take. Where are we now with the curriculum? Well, I've tried to do a PMI on it. If we have a look on the plus side, there is general agreement in Scotland that this is a good approach. There is all-party support in all the political parties on this. The research that we did in 2012 suggested that the majority of teachers actually support the principles in broad terms. In fact, what we did was we made a distinction between first and second order engagement. We found a lot of first order engagement, which we described as teachers broadly welcoming the principles, but what we found less of was evidence that they fully understood the implications of these principles for education, the second order engagement. Education Scotland and the Scottish Government buy into these, but they also are starting to recognise the problems. There's an OECD evaluation happening next year, and people are talking quite frankly about this curriculum, warts and all, which is encouraging, I think. One thing that we have seen big changes on is more varied approaches to teaching. When I arrived in Scotland in 2001, I was horrified to see that the standard teaching methodology in my subject, history, in secondary schools was death by 1,000 worksheets. Right? That has changed. You're more likely now, if you go into a school in any part of Scotland, to see death by cooperative learning. Cooperative learning has come in big style. Now, I'm actually quite a fan of cooperative learning, but I think it also has its place. It's good for some purposes, not so good for others. But we've certainly seen that. Now, whether those changes we've seen are actually due to the new curriculum, I'm not convinced about that. I think they were happening anyway. On the minus side, we see tensions in the system between Curriculum for Excellence and the system itself. What I mentioned earlier on, there's a mismatch here, for example, between the constructivist aims of the curriculum and the transmissionist sort of philosophy of Scottish teachers. There's also a tension between and within policies. So the government will quite happily articulate policies which are actually getting in the way of the new curriculum rather than driving it along. We're seeing still a lot of overcrowding. We're seeing an intensification of workload. And I think that that's largely down to the methodology which has been used. What tends to happen is that instead of people thinking holistically about the curriculum, people are adding bits on to tick boxes. I'll come back to that when I go through these 3 trajectories. We are seeing a shift in assessment as well. The early outcomes were deliberately framed to be flexible, some would say vague. But what's happened is that they've been increasingly used as standards. The early documentation said they were not standards for assessment. Later documentation is now being very explicit in saying they are standards for assessment. And they go so far as to helpfully define a standard as something against which we measure performance. So we're seeing quite a change as over time, over the 10 years, we're seeing a shift in the philosophy around some of these ideas. In the interesting category here, I think what we're seeing is often minimal and strategic change. And for me, that raises questions about why we're seeing this sort of change. And again, this relates back to the curriculum development methodology. We are seeing a lot of controversy and debate. I can guarantee that at the moment there will be a debate going on Twitter somewhere about whether or not CFE, as it's called, is being implemented properly or not. We're also seeing in Scotland an increasing interest in practitioner research, which for me offers one possibility for engaging with the curriculum differently. Okay, so very briefly, because I'm aware of time here, there has been some systematic critique of this curriculum model, not just Curriculum for Excellence, but this sort of generic model that we've got. Michael Young, who refers to it as a technical rational curriculum, talks about downgraded knowledge. Lisa Wheeler talked about a crisis of curriculum. Now, these writers are often coming from a social realist background, and I don't hold with the critique, which is basically that everything would be all right if we only went back to disciplinary knowledge and subjects. But they have a point, I think, that the curriculum has not articulated a substantive way of deriving content from curricular aims, and I think that's a weakness of it. Some people go further. My colleague Kate Watson says that Curriculum for Excellence is actually quite sinister because it doesn't set out what children are expected to know, but how they should be. She sees that as indoctrination. And that would, I think, maybe chime against some of the stuff we've heard this morning. We've seen this assessment creep, which I've already described, and this growth of output regulation. There is a new benchmarking tool which has replaced the old, what was called standard tables and charts. The new one's called Insight. And Insight will allow schools to compare their performance in all accredited examinations and qualifications against other schools. And already, it's been in operation for 6 months, already we're seeing evidence of children on level 5 being dumped down to level 4 because it puts the school in a bad light. So we're seeing this sort of new types of performativity growing here. I think a lot of the problems here stem from a lack of coherence in the curriculum model itself. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But basically what Curriculum for Excellence is doing is creating multiple starting points for curriculum development. We're starting here alternatively from knowledge, the content we want to teach, and Curriculum for Excellence allows that. We can start from the outcomes, the experiences and outcomes that I showed you, which often leads to a certain type of approach. Or we can use a process curriculum model. Okay, now, we were shown earlier on by Kathy a cartoon, a very old one. This is a newer cartoon, which is on Jamie Mackenzie's website, which I think is particularly apt when you're looking at any sort of curriculum innovation in schools, particularly one that's driven from the top down. Right? For those of you who can't see it from the back, what the teacher is doing is stuffing a computer into a turkey, and the caption says, "stuffing the bird." It doesn't seem to fit very well. No matter, the principal said we had no choice. Okay? In many of the schools that I go to, this is what I'm seeing with Curriculum for Excellence. We're seeing something that doesn't quite match being forced into place in a context that needs maybe a bit of modification to make it work. And people are employing workarounds, but they're often not very systematic workarounds they're employing here. And what we end up with is, as I've said, intensification of workload, incoherence across the curriculum, and actually a lot of teacher anxiety as well, because they can see that they're doing things they really don't want to do. Okay, one of the issues I think, and this is I think about how we conceptualize curriculum and curriculum development, is that we need to think about what these different levels actually are. There is too much of a tendency, I think, in Scotland to see Curriculum for Excellence as a set of instructions, and if we just implement it, then everything will be okay. But of course it isn't that. At a macro level, what Curriculum for Excellence is a policy intention statement. It's a set of aspirations about what the curriculum might look like. It needs developing. Well, a lot of that development work's been done at this middle level by people like Education Scotland, and they'll produce further guidance on this. And then at the micro level, we've got curriculum as practices, where curriculum has been implemented or developed or enacted by teachers. I prefer to use the word enacted because I think implementation smacks far too much of delivery and following instructions. So another way of looking at that here, and I think this has been one of the problems that's blighted the curriculum, is that we've seen policy guidance in the early days, broad statements which are highly aspirational about what education is for. We're seeing that stuff being reinterpreted at a meso level, and then worryingly what we're seeing is reinterpreted reinterpretations. So we're seeing this sort of Chinese whispers effect as we go down the chain. And often the curriculum practice which are emerging are quite different to the policy intentions. And the work we've been doing with local authorities in Scotland, we've been trying to work around that in a way that re-engages teachers with the original policy ideas. Okay, so I'm going now to spend the rest of this talk outlining 3 possible trajectories which we can take if developing this sort of curriculum. And this is sort of rooted in the work of Lawrence Stenhouse, writing back in the 1970s, or in A.V. Kelly more recently. And those 3 models, I prefer not to call them models because I see them as starting points, are a content curriculum where we say that the first step in deciding the curriculum is to decide what it is we're going to teach. We start from the content. Okay? The second one is to start with the specifications of outcomes to be achieved. And we're all familiar with that. And the third one is a specification of long-term goals and purposes as a starting point, and then the process is about identifying content and methods which are fit for those purposes. Now, these might seem like fine distinctions, but in fact, Curriculum for Excellence offers all 3 starting points, and schools have taken all 3 starting points. My view is that, in fact, if we start with content, what we're doing is missing a significant set of questions here, which is, what are we doing it for? The same if all we're doing is outcomes. We're not actually starting with statements of purpose. We may then subsequently proceed to think about content. We may even think about content expressed as outcomes, although I have my objections to that on other grounds as well. Okay, so if we start with knowledge as a starting point, this has been gathering a head of steam in the UK recently. Michael Young and his ilk have been writing a lot of very powerful stuff around the notion of powerful knowledge, the notion that schools should be teaching disciplinary knowledge as opposed to everyday knowledge, and that this knowledge is best enshrined in traditional subjects. Okay? Not a point I follow at all. There's also been quite an influx of ideas from the United States. The work of Hirsch and cultural literacy has heavily influenced certainly the Conservative government that's in for the UK. That's not Scotland. Scotland is a devolved system for education, so it has its own system. My view here, that knowledge is not a suitable starting point because we start to miss questions like relevance and questions about purpose. We're running the risk here of falling into the trap of the saber-tooth curriculum. Don't know whether people are familiar with that story. This was a parable written in the United States about 80 years ago about a fabled time in Stone Age times when an educator came up with a curriculum which was for educating the local people. And one of the subjects was saber-toothed tiger scaring. It was a useful subject because the saber-toothed tigers came into the village. What happened, of course, was there was an ice age and saber-toothed tiger became extinct. The subject stayed on the school curriculum. And it stayed and it stayed. And when people tried to remove it, they were told, well, what you're talking about is not education, it's training, right? Education is timeless. Now, this was written about the place of Latin, but it's easy to see how the curriculum becomes ossified, how it becomes set in stone. Knowledge approaches also, I think, encourage transmissionist approaches to teaching, getting through the content. They encourage overcrowding. And I think we have to make the point that I'd made earlier on as well, that knowledge is not the same as disciplines, and that disciplines are not the same as subjects. There are lots of different ways to organise the knowledge that we put in front of young people. According to Michael Young and his colleagues, knowledge is powerful because its origins lie in academic disciplines. Academic disciplines which have spent years working out what valid knowledge is or not. And there is a point there, but actually what it doesn't do is consider the future orientation of knowledge for its social and scientific and practical utility. So we need, I think, a more sophisticated way of looking at how we identify knowledge. Now, taking the trajectory here, if we were to treat this type of curriculum as a content curriculum, and this is largely happening in secondary schools in Scotland, we start with just framing what we do around the existing subjects that we have. And those existing subjects are set in stone. They've been around for a long time. Curriculum for Excellence doesn't challenge that. It talks about the importance of knowledge, but it doesn't specify. At a meso level, we've got very confused messages about knowledge in Curriculum for Excellence. And what I think is missing from this is that there is no specification, no guidance about how you take the big ideas and derive content from them. At a micro level, we're working with all sorts of things here. For example, the epistemological assumptions of teachers who are grounded in a very transmissionist approach. Often content is chosen to fit existing resources or just to replicate existing habits. New content, if it's chosen, is often selected for interest, I heard about a school that spent a whole term doing the history of racing cars because they decided they needed an interdisciplinary unit, and racing cars was the theme. Now, for me, I don't think that that constitutes powerful knowledge in history. Others may disagree, of course. We have the potential for major gaps. One of the enduring complaints of the history curriculum in Scotland is that young people miss whole subjects out, but quite possibly have done Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia 4 or 5 times over their 5 years in high school. And we have a situation in Scotland where qualifications continue to drive what is taught, particularly in the senior school. And I think overall what we have here is a lack of fit between curricular purpose and the content that we put in the curriculum. So I'm rejecting that approach. Teachers we talk to on our research projects add some credence to these sorts of patterns happening. So, for example, they talk about it dumbing down subject specialism, and that shows really the importance that they place on the subject specialism in Scotland. But also it shows that people are actually quite adept at working with the curriculum, often by changing the language of what they do, adopting the new curricular language to describe existing patterns of practice. And that is not change, that is just tinkering. Okay, if we're to start with outcomes then, that offers us a different starting point. I won't go much into the roots, but it was interesting to hear Kathy talk about this morning, of the roots of many of these ideas in Taylorist scientific management. So we've got theories like Bobbitt and Tyler and Bloom, for example. Bobbitt had written a book back in the 1920s, I think it was, that was full of outcomes. It was everything we need to know expressed as an objective or a set of objectives. Bloom's taxonomy looks a bit similar to that as well. There was a move in the United Kingdom in the 80s for the development of competency-based curricula, and particularly in vocational areas. ScotVec was the organisation in Scotland that took these, developed them, and sold them around the world very successfully. We've seen the development of top-down teacher-proof national curricula in England with linear levels, outcomes set out as levels. And in fact, when Curriculum for Excellence came along, as I suggested, what we've had is the adoption of these approaches, and the continued adherence to the idea of outcomes set out as levels. So if we were to follow the logic again of this and follow the trajectory here, what the government have done is created a starting point for curriculum development, which is these E's and O's, experiences and outcomes. They have said at the start that they're making them looser and less prescriptive because they've been 15 years of experience of working with the previous curriculum where these things were driving through assessment. But at the same time, we see this continued focus on this outcome steering, so there's mixed messages about what's important here. At a middle level, at a meso level, we've seen this discourse shift. So these vague, flexible outcomes have increasingly become used as standards for assessment. We see this continued focus on attainment. So Education Scotland has a dual role, curriculum development and inspection. So all schools will get inspected, and Neil here will tell you in graphic detail what it's like to have a team of people descend on you for a couple of weeks. Not a nice experience. At a micro level, and we've got some empirical evidence for this, what we're seeing are these new forms of performativity. So teachers and managers in schools are making decisions which aren't about benefiting the students, they're about benefiting the schools, making the schools' performance look better. I found some evidence in 2010. There were 2 qualifications at the same level, level 5 on the framework. And then the pupils would take one and move to level 6. But if they struggled with the level 6, they were being put down a level again and made to do the level 5 qualification that they hadn't done. So effectively, they were duplicating. 2010, 2011, 5,000 students sat a qualification in English at a level that they had already because the schools were saying, we're not having you doing higher, you'll mess our stats up. That was a very common practice. Very assessment-heavy practices. We're seeing, for example, dual marking across every single piece of work that's done at the age of 15, level 5 or level 4, has been dual marked for moderation, right? And this is creating a lot of work. A lot of bureaucracy that goes with that. The paperwork is incredible. And this tendency for people to think about curriculum change, not in terms of how we develop a good education from purposes, but in terms of how we meet the demands set out in these outcomes. Tick, done that one. Tick, done that one. Don't need to think about it anymore. Okay, so we see some evidence of this here. Two research projects. Our teacher agency research in 2012 showed here that actually, although the ESNOs were meant to declutter the program, what actually people are doing is building these huge edifices on it, and it's all about evidencing. It's driven by what parents want. At the end of the day, a parent still wants to know exactly where their child is in language and maths. Are they on a par with their peers? So there's this sort of constant pressure to perform. And the result of that, in the bottom extract here, is someone saying, I can cover all of these assessment parts in one project here, one short project. It's not exactly the way they're saying it, but you're not saying we can't do it this way. And it meets all the criteria. I can tick all the boxes quite confidently. That is one thing you can see with Curriculum for Excellence, that the rules aren't quite as strict, and you can tweak them without feeling too guilty. Okay. Now, I've been entirely negative so far, so I want to finish on a positive note. What I've described are two fairly common trajectories that schools are taking in developing the curriculum from the documentation provided by the Scottish Government. What I want to do here is to show how you can take a more constructive approach using purposes as a starting point and really following what Kelly would describe as a process curriculum. This is rooted very much in sort of Deweyan ideas about concern about the growth of children and the growth of individuals and education for democracy. So the starting point for educational planning here is not a consideration of the nature of knowledge, nor is it a consideration of what culture we want to transmit, nor is it a statement of these narrow atomized ends we wish to achieve, whether they're economic or behavioral, but instead from a concern with the nature of a child and his or her development as a human being. Okay? So, is Curriculum for Excellence a process curriculum? It could be. And this is the point I made this morning about workarounds. The policy is sufficiently flexible that you can actually choose which starting point you have. This is the starting point that, in my view, is the most constructive one. Right? The policy clearly specifies these well-articulated purposes and principles, the four capacities and their attributes and capabilities. If we take a view of policy not as a set of instructions, but instead as a framework of cognitive resources to guide action, to guide the development of practices, then that puts quite a different slant on it. At this point then, what we're finding is that the meso-level stuff is actually quite unhelpful, right? There isn't a clear specification of processes, which arguably should be the job of a curriculum development agency, right? There should be less reinterpretation of reinterpretation because it confuses matters. There is no shortage of guidance on this, but the problem is a lot of the guidance is actually next to useless. And we need to address these issues that lead to performativity. You know, thinking about how we frame inspections, for example, and how we use assessment data. We've been working for 3 years now with a group of practitioners in a local authority, East Lothian. We're on our 3rd cohort. We're working with around 30 a time. And what we've done is we've taken them through a process here. I've listed 4 of the aspects of that. There is a 5th one, which is called collaborative professional inquiry, and that is the methodology. This takes a year to do, and what we're doing is we're getting people to work on small, manageable projects. But rather than just saying, do a project and record what's happening, traditional action research or practitioner inquiry project, what we're saying is that we want it linking back. So the process is that we spend quite a bit of time doing some sense-making around these big ideas. What do they mean? What are the implications of them? How do they tie in with your views about the purposes of education? Then we think about how content might be selected with the notion that we are selecting powerful content. Now, I'm not of a school of thought that says, as some do in Scotland, that we're not doing knowledge anymore, it's all about skills now. I see these as two sides of the same coin. Okay, I think knowledge is important for the modern world, for the 21st century. So powerful knowledge in terms of its practical, social, scientific utility. We also get them to think about powerful pedagogies. That's a term that's used by my colleague at Newcastle University, David Leeds. I think Bob Lingard's also used it. Powerful pedagogies is acknowledging that actually not only what we learn, but how we learn it is instrumental in developing the individual, developing the person. So cooperative learning is a powerful pedagogy for some things. For other things, I'm actually quite a fan of direct teaching. I think that works as well. I've always been a fan of inquiry-based learning, structured critical inquiry, and I think the emphasis being on the word structure here, not open-ended stuff. Okay? And I see the teacher's role in this as being about framing a set of educational experiences or transactions which lead to the sort of growth that we're looking for the personal development. I was also interested this morning to hear one of the speakers talking about doing a sort of situational analysis, and that's one of the things that we get the school to do here. These steps here are about working out what it is we're supposed to be doing and how we're going to do it. This here, when we decided what we're going to do, is working out what's going to get in the way and what's going to help it. So this is about doing a contextual analysis or a contextual audit and working out exactly what we need to change in the environment. Now, an obvious question for me, for secondary schools in Scotland, is asking why the secondary schools have not done much to change their timetables. Predominantly, you have 52-minute periods in secondary schools in Scotland. Right? I know of one school in Scotland that's moved to a 20-period week, 2-hour periods, or 1 hour, 50 minutes. That school is able to do things now like roll a bus up to the front of the building, take people out on a field trip, and get them back in time for the next lesson. Right? The schools that have stuck with the 52-minute period are doing things like saying you can't take a group out of school on a field trip. We ran a conference recently on politics, and we had 150 students come. With 2 days to go, 2 of the schools pulled out, saying that they couldn't have so many people out of school at such an important time of year, October, right? And part of a sort of September to June year. So we're not exactly interfering with exams, but they couldn't have so many people out of school missing other lessons. So these people didn't come, and they missed out on what was a fantastic experience. So one of the things that schools should be doing, I think, is addressing these. What are the key roles here? Where are the resources coming from? Do you need to send people on particular courses to upskill them? Are there any bottlenecks in the way we do things that are going to get in the way, etc.? This project here, we've been running now, as I said, for 3 years, and there's some teacher voices here. The top one is actually someone bemoaning the fact that we don't actually get to sit down, and this is in the local authority that Neil works in. We don't do enough a look at the philosophy behind it. How often in school was teachers sit down? You just said to me, have you got a philosophy of education? I'm sure most people have, but we don't talk about it. Okay? We don't ever sit down and say, right, let's share our philosophies and come up with a philosophy for our school. We look at minutiae. On a more recent project, teacher agency project, we looked at 2 secondary schools, one of which we saw high levels of teacher agency and curriculum development, and the other one we saw very low levels of agency, lack of confidence generally. The difference between the 2 schools, and the only substantive difference we could find, was that one of them made spaces for dialogue. There was a lot of collaborative working going on, and an effort by the senior management of the school to create connections across faculties for that purpose. The other school, everything was passed down the line, and they said the staff meetings were like school assemblies. It just didn't work. So when do we sit down to look at our philosophy of education, I think, is an important question. Well, these teachers here, and this is part of our first cohort, did actually sit down, and this is what they said. This is one of the head teachers. The school-based curriculum development approach allowed staff to space the question our approach to teaching and learning. It has promoted professional discussion about our different approaches. It has made teachers more aware of the original purpose of CFE and reminded them of the capacities and how these are not things that had been done before and forgotten about, but should be central to our planning, evaluations and assessment. So powerful evidence here from a group of teachers who have been through this process that actually they understand the curriculum better, they've got a better confidence in dealing with it, and because the local authority in this case has acted as a shield, they're able also to innovate in a way that protects them from some of the negative consequences that they might have otherwise. So in terms of implications, what I'm suggesting here in Scotland is that the high-level policy, which is aspirational, which has some good strong points here. How long? Is that 5 minutes? 1 minute, okay, perfect. It opens up spaces for teacher agency, so it's in the right direction. Because of the flexibility or ambiguity of the policy, but it can afford opportunities to skilled practitioners. And actually in many schools a lot is being done. But we've still got too much emphasis here on raising the individual capacity of teachers, We've got less emphasis on the conditions by means of which teachers work, so school structures, school cultures, etc. And I'm suggesting here that if we want to make this work properly, what we need to do is the following. We need to address some of the tensions in the system, and that's not going to happen in a hurry, I'm afraid. We need to have policy documents which are more explicit about the sorts of processes I've just described. And actually, we need teachers to be trusted, because I've yet to meet a teacher who isn't a responsible professional. Okay, I think we'd get a lot more out of teachers if we did trust them. And finally, this is a big criticism of Curriculum for Excellence. We need much more research, because at the moment they're still saying that the research evidence they have is inspection reports. Okay, I've listed the references here, and I'm more than happy for this to be circulated as well to the delegates. And I think we have about 10 minutes for discussion.
So thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time. Well, now we have time for questions.
I think that's my microphone that's making that. That's it.
Turn that one off.
It's off. It's off, right? Yeah. Okay.
Hello? Yeah. It was just for a point of clarification. You mentioned 15-year-olds and level 4. Could you just... Is that a Scottish level 4?
Yeah, there's the Scottish Qualifications and Credit Framework, which I don't know what level 1, 2 are actually, but level 3 is Access, which is sort of basic level, and then level 4 and level 5 are what would be equivalent to GCSE in England. And then level, which would be taken at 16, and then level 6 is higher, which is equivalent to AS level in England, and then there's also a qualification at level 7 called Advanced Higher. Confusingly, students in Scotland go to university often at the end of their hires, so year 1 in university is the same, it's level 7 generally.
Yes, I realised it was going to be a confusing answer. Yeah. And of course this then needs to be translated into the European levels too, for this audience. So.
Yes, probably, but I'm not sure I can do that.
Well, this is an unusual gathering for me because I so much enjoyed your presentation and the presentations this morning, but I'm a small school principal of a primary school in Scotland who's been living this story, and this curriculum came in 2004, and for me it was wonderful. The central message we were given, which you showed in those principles, the attributes and capabilities, were wonderful. The problem has been that we hadn't, as Mark hinted at, but I want to say much more, we had an accountability system that had vast amounts of documentation and new documentation to completely different principles. And then the curriculum became overrun by what I would say is Pasi Sahlberg, the Finnish educationist's product model of curriculum. And these experiences and outcomes you meant, there's actually 350 pages of them, and it became like a painting by numbers kit. So I won't go more than that, but the presentations we heard this morning were the types of curriculum I was trying to put in place. But the problem with the accountability system was it's imposing definitions on you. So when people had different conceptual frameworks, they would write reports on the practice in our school, which I had no ownership of, and which I actually formally rejected, which was very, very unusual. And the only other unusual thing for me here was I wrote this up in a very short article, which is actually on Joe Blower's blog here, called Finnish Lessons for Scotland, because I feel that there were two completely different models of education being articulated, which is what Mark has been said. One which was quite close to how Pasi Sahlberg was outlining Finnish lessons, and a whole different conceptual framework around the very things that Helen was talking about this morning. And then we've got a performativity culture, which is about measurable outcomes, and the worst of all, the inspection agency seeking to micromanage in Taylorist fashion, from your presentation, exactly how we perform and imposing those in reports. So we have this massive contradiction, which I quite mind to get written up, because the school I'm in, we've written so many innovations which were to do with our community, which couldn't be prescribed in fixed outcomes, although they could in the broad ones. So Scotland's got a journey to go. Frustrating and exciting at the same time.
I was taken by one of the points on the slide was that constructivism versus transmissionism, which is a great word. There seems to be quite a, I don't know what's happening in Scotland, but in England certainly, a sort of real shift by the Jesuits of the Church of Evidence to really focus on everything that we can measure. Do you think that's part of the tension that you're talking about in this constructivism versus transmissionism? Is it, is it just really now, with the measurement obsession and fetishes, we're just only the stuff we can measure? I mean, there was a ridiculous report that came out from the Sutton Trust recently that absolutely only supported direct instruction and said, children don't learn by inquiry, which of course is nonsense. Could you comment on that, please?
Right, could I comment on that? Well, first of all, just to say that, in some levels, the sort of transmissionism versus constructivism is a crude dichotomy. I mean, what we're looking at is a continuum here. And if you add to that, I suppose the dynamic of whether or not we're measuring or not, maybe there's a way of representing this on a quadrant. I've not explored it. But yes, you've got a teaching workforce in Scotland which is largely framed around the needs to the need to transmit content, and that's what I'm describing as transmissionism. They see their mission as teaching young people stuff, things. And then at the other end, you've got this shiny new curriculum which never explicitly calls itself constructivist, but can be recognised as a constructivist approach in terms of how it talks about experience and building knowledge and so on, and development of skills. But I don't think that the accountability stuff sits neatly with that. I think that's a separate set of discourses that the government imposes throughout the public services in Scotland, and it's a sort of pale version of what's happening in England. It's not as fierce, but it's there nevertheless. And when you talk to senior inspectors, for example, I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, they do not seem to be able to construct a vision of education in their heads that's anything else other than measurable outputs, right? So I had a conversation with one of them, and I said to him, wouldn't it be good to start viewing education in terms of the inputs, what we put into it, and the way in which we construct quality experiences from which young people learn? And he said, I've never looked at it that way before. Now, that's a senior inspector in charge of, at a very high level in Scotland's National Curriculum Development Agency. And it's that sort of thinking. So it's associated with a whole range of discourses which I find very unhelpful. I've written about on my blog. For example, the language of delivery, that we see education as a product to deliver rather than as an experience or a process to take place. I remember a head teacher I worked with years ago, before this language became more pervasive, saying, what are we, milkmen or something, the first time he saw it in a policy document. And then you've got sort of added to that this whole sort of language of learning, which my colleague Gert Biester calls learnification of education, which is where we've moved away from thinking about learning as a process that happens as people become educated individuals, and we've moved away from questions of what people learn and why people learn. Learning has become a decontextualized technical process that people talk about learners instead of students, for example. And Gert's written some quite powerful stuff on that. So I think there's a sort of confused mishmash of different discourses here, within which sits this sort of tension in Scotland between transmission and constructivism. Does that address your question? Yeah.
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. So thanks for that. That was really interesting. I have huge sympathy for the what you were talking about, how we're all in the midst of this mishmash of multiple systems at once. If I'm trying to be optimistic, I think this chaos is what happens before you start coming, when you're at a transitional time, and that hopefully there's enough anger on all levels of the system, from kids to parents to teachers, and even to some administrators. And I've even spoken at accreditation agencies where they don't even like it, which I think is pretty interesting. A tiny thing on those pencils I distributed out in my talk, there's a URL for this new program I'm doing. One thing we're trying to do is get people from around the world who are interested in data collection to help us measure, do a measures outcomes of measures outcomes. We're trying to turn the tool back and see how much money is being spent and how much time is being spent on measuring outcomes, and do a global graph of how much is being spent on that relative to cut budgets in teaching and learning. And we've done some preliminary data so far, and it sure looks like the measures and outcomes budgets are going up at a incrementally much greater rate than the teaching and learning budget. So if anyone here is interested in participating, you can reach me on that, and we're just starting it. But
You can count me in on that, certainly.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. And if you know any quantitative people that are looking for a great project to contribute to,
Yeah.
we really need some people who have some skills at that.
Yeah, okay, and I'll certainly do that. And you used the word mishmash, which I think I'd used earlier on as well. There was my colleague from Newcastle, David Leet, who I've done quite a bit of work on around output regulation particularly. He's got a PhD student who actually wrote about teachers and their responses to this sort of constant performativity. And she coined the phrase that it's done through mishmashing, which is a different way of saying workaround. So I think that's quite nice.
Can you say the phrase again, what through
Mishmashing
mishmashing?
is another term for workaround.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So you're faced with impossible contradictions and tensions in what you're supposed to do, so you just mishmash. You can be multiple personalities at the same time. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. I think I have three thoughts you just kind of made me think of, and I just want to throw them back at you. One would be in Canada, some of these ideas around curriculum and competencies, and they're a little bit out there. Like I read some of those, like respect for others, right? Like, what does that look like? There's not like one poster that says this is what respect looks like. So some of it can be quite subjective, and maybe even floating and changing. But then that means if we're going to achieve any of this, we have to address our accountability systems and how we are using accountability in a very much a test and punish type methods. And some systems are bad, and some systems like the U.S. are worse. But we have to address that. If you don't change how you count or measure or use accountability, then nothing will change. Except for people will pretend that they're making changes. They'll stuff the turkey full of computers, but nothing will actually, other than in name, will change. You mentioned trusting teachers. If we take other education systems that do well, and that's in like not just on tests, but in through things like equity and equality, so like Finland perhaps, then we have to look at how they treat teachers, and we have to be very, very serious about how we have to trust them to be able to do this stuff, and then we have to understand that teachers don't need surveillance; they need support. The systems public education is being starved to death and undermined for all sorts of political and profiteering, which is another session. But teachers just don't have enough support, and they're being asked to do more and more with less and less. And that it's even become a mantra of Arne Duncan in the States, where doing more with less is the new normal.
It's a virtue.
That's actually a thing that people are saying now. And then the last thing is, like the quality of these ideas do not justify stuffing them down people's throats. So even if you have a good policy or a good curriculum, we have to shift from doing things to teachers to working with them. They have to be brought in on the process, not so we can sell it to them. I'm not, as a teacher, I'm not interested in buying anything, but I want to be a part of the process because I love my job. And I love kids, and I love teaching. So we have to bring teachers in on this and work with them to develop this. If curriculum is still being created and laminated and mailed to the schools by distance authorities, I don't care how good the curriculum is, it still is missing the point. Because you're going to alienate not only the kids who are supposed to learn it, but the teachers who are supposed to teach it.
Yeah. Okay, just come back briefly on 2 points there. The first one about mantras like respect and so on. For me, the answer to that is actually to spend time sense-making around them. It's not just to treat them as slogans, it's to spend time working out what exactly do we mean as a school when we talk about respect or responsibility or democracy or critical thought or whatever those slogans might be. So I think that a lot more effort needs to go into actually that sort of level of mediation and sense-making by teachers rather than perhaps the money that goes in at the top end of the system in producing the ideas. So that's one point. The other point relates to trusting teachers. I'm not an advocate of complete school autonomy. We've worked with people who are. I'm an advocate, though, of policy which provides support and guidance rather than prescription, and I think that's an important distinction. So I think there's also a distinction there between autonomy, which could be seen as a sort of lack of regulation, and agency, which is where we're afforded by our own abilities on the one hand, but also by the environment we're working in, the support and resources we have, including relational resources, to actually achieve agency, to do our jobs properly. And that's quite a key distinction, I think.
Mark, that was great. Really good discussion. And I wondered if you found teachers taking leadership in some of these schools that we have seen. I know in our work with exemplar schools, and as we visited like 40 plus schools across the states and identified exemplars. We then looked and said, okay, what's different about these schools that are not kind of the same things everybody says? What's about leadership? It's about this and that. One of the two primary things we found, one was around that teachers were not just, they were supported and they were trusted, but they took leadership of the school. It was a collaborative kind of responsibility for every student. And the other was that they were very careful in involving the community and matching the community and the curriculum and the students in the school, kind of aligning all of that, a very kind of bottom-up and top-down approach. And I just wondered if you had any kind of experience around that.
Yes, we do. Unfortunately, I see too many teachers who say, just tell me what to do. I'm a teacher, not a leader. I don't want to be given this responsibility. But I think that's quite a natural reaction if you're working in a high-risk environment where, a bad error can be treated very harshly. We have come across teachers who are taking significant leadership roles, and some of the factors you're talking about are absolutely crucial there. But actually, more than anything else, this is, I think, a question of agency. Where teachers are able to achieve agency, and I'm using very explicitly here an ecological view of agency. Agency is something that happens if there's a conjunction of the right skills and the right environment. Where teachers achieve agency, it's because they have supportive head teachers, for example, who protect them and provide them with the right resources. They're sitting in the middle of extensive and rich relational networks which provide relational resources for what they're doing. They have good skills, and a lot of teachers I work with have good skills but can't use them. They're disabled from using them, but these teachers have good skills. And they're people who have a clear sense of what it is they want to do. So the model we've outlined around agency looks at the projective element of agency. This is the ability to project to the future, to imagine alternative futures, and to maneuver between repertoires, even if you're in quite constrained situations. And so teachers who take long-term responsibility for their students, rather than just thinking about getting through the day or the demands of the next test, etc., are really these people you're talking about. And I do see plenty of them, yes.
So thank you very much, Mark. I think absolutely interesting, the item. Mark will be available again in 30 minutes in the coffee break. So now we will move on and go to this afternoon demo. So thank you very much.